I'm Hannah Cole, 35, and 5 days before Christmas, my phone lit up with a message that hollowed the room. Don't come home. We've moved on without you. I stared at the screen long enough to hear my heartbeat and typed a single reply. All right, then shut the phone off and set it face down. The silence that followed felt heavier than any ruck I'd carried, and I thought that was the end of it. The next morning, 10 missed calls stacked like dominoes I refused to touch. The 11th was a voicemail from a law office I didn't recognize, asking for my required presence. Required, not requested. By sundown, I learned the word they hadn't said for 3 years: mother. That night, I ironed a plain blouse, laid out my discharge papers by habit, and prepared to walk into a room where I suspected the story about me had already been told. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to hold your ground in a room that hoped you'd fold, tap, like, and subscribe so we can keep each other company. I grew up in a small ranch house where my mother Diane folded kindness into everything. Notes in lunch bags, coffee left warming a porch light that stayed on until I was safe inside. She believed decency was a daily practice, not an announcement, and she lived it even when money was thin and the station wagon coughed through winter. When she married Alan Mercer, the house stayed the same size, but the rules changed. He liked things measured, who used what, who deserved what, while his son Kyle floated from one advantage to the next, a used BMW at 16 tuition, paid twice over, and always a fresh story for why responsibility could wait. I learned early that integrity wasn't a word you put on the wall. You carried it in the quiet, especially when it wasn't fashionable. At 18, the Army offered what our living room didn't clear lines earned respect and a way to serve that didn't depend on anyone's mood at dinner. I shipped out with my mother waving small and bright at the airport gate, and I kept that picture of her in my rucksack through desert heat and midnight shifts, telling myself that coming home would be the reward we both deserved. The years stretched in deployments and rotations, holidays spent under string lights, taped to cinder block phone calls, timed around time zones and generators, and I learned to make a life inside the space between what you hope for and what you can touch. My mother met me there letter by letter until her messages thinned and explanations arrived from Alan. Instead, she was resting the computer was down. I should focus on my duty. I believed him because belief kept the machine of my days running, and because it never occurred to me that a porch light could be switched off by anyone but the woman who turned it on. When the attorney's voicemail said reading of the will, the words didn't land at once. They scattered like spilled screws, and I gathered them slowly, reading will required, until the shape formed and the air changed. No one had told me she was gone. No one had offered me a pew at her funeral or a folded program to tuck into my pocket, and the ache of that fact settled in places training can't reach. I dressed in what I had, civilian and plain, and drove to a building with glass doors that didn't know my name. The conference room was full when I stepped in. Black dresses, dark suits, the hum of whispers that go flat as soon as they meet your eyes. Aunt Ruth lifted a hand half an inch. Uncle Walter looked at his shoes, and Alan sat at the head of the table with Kyle beside him, like this was his living room and I was late. I took the only open chair across from them, the one that felt as intentional as the empty place setting you notice after the meal, and folded my hands where I could see them. Evelyn Hart introduced herself with a nod that landed like a steadying palm, and as she opened a worn leather briefcase, Alan cleared his throat and said, "I didn't belong here, that family matters were for family." I didn't answer because the room had been hungry for a story, and I refused to feed it. I waited the way you do when you know what you came for and what you won't carry home again. Evelyn set a sealed envelope on the table, and without looking away from me said I was named, that my presence wasn't a favor, but a requirement, and the temperature in the room shifted by a degree you could feel in your teeth. She reached for the seal, and I understood that whatever came next would not be the story they'd rehearsed. The room was too still, the kind of silence that hums just before thunder. I could hear the slow scrape of Alan's chair as he leaned back, studying me like I'd wandered into the wrong place. "She doesn't belong here," he said finally, his voice smooth but cracking at the edges. Evelyn didn't flinch. "Ms. Cole has every legal right to be present," she replied, her tone measured, deliberate. Your wife named her specifically. The words dropped like pebbles into deep water, and the ripples moved through the room. A few heads turned. Ruth whispered something to Walter under her breath, while Kyle sat rigid beside his father, the corner of his mouth curled in that old practiced smirk. Alan's gaze found me again. Diane was heartbroken, he said, his voice rising. Every holiday she asked if Hannah would call. Every birthday she set a place for her daughter, and it stayed empty. He looked around the table as if collecting sympathy like signatures. My wife died waiting for her child to come home. I kept my eyes on the mahogany grain, tracing the swirls with my thumb. Evelyn cleared her throat, ready to steer the meeting back to order, but Alan wasn't finished. She made her choice. He continued, stabbing the air in my direction. She left her mother to chase a uniform. She left family behind for strangers. I'd heard that argument my entire life, every version of it. It was his favorite story to tell, how he'd taken in a girl who didn't belong and how she'd proven him right by leaving. Only this time I didn't answer. Years in uniform had taught me that silence can say more than words ever could. I could feel the tension tightening around the table, that slow collective breath people take when waiting for a fight. I kept my hands folded, my back straight, and let him fill the air with his performance. Across from him, Ruth's jaw clenched. Walter looked uneasy. Evelyn's eyes flicked from me to the folder in front of her. If we're finished debating family loyalty, she said, we can proceed. Alan gave a sharp laugh. Proceed. There's no need for this charade. My wife and I had an agreement. The estate goes to the surviving spouse. That's me. He looked around as if daring someone to disagree. Evelyn opened the folder and set a sealed envelope on the table. There was an amendment, she said calmly. The word hung there unfamiliar and heavy, 2 weeks before her passing. The reaction was instant. Kyle's chair screeched back as he stood up. That's impossible, he barked. She was barely coherent at the end. She didn't even know what she was signing. Evelyn's expression didn't change. Mrs. Cole was of sound mind. I have affidavits from her doctors confirming that. Alan's face lost its color. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. I could almost hear the calculation behind his eyes, how much had already been spent, how much he'd assumed was his. Around us the murmurs grew louder. Diane's brother, Uncle Peter, spoke for the first time. Alan, he said quietly, you told us she didn't make any changes. You said she was too sick. Alan's jaw tightened. Because she was, he snapped. Evelyn's mistaken. Evelyn set her hands flat on the table. I am not, she said. Your wife was clear. She wanted her intentions read aloud to her family. The atmosphere shifted again, curiosity replacing pity, suspicion replacing calm. I felt it moving through the room like a draft. Alan leaned forward, his knuckles white. She wouldn't have done that without me. Evelyn met his stare. She came to my office alone. That sentence cracked whatever mask he'd been holding. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Ruth's hand went to her mouth. Alone, she whispered. She told me she was visiting me that day. Evelyn nodded. She did. You drove her here. Ruth sat back in her chair, the memory rearranging itself in real time. She said she needed to stop by the bank. Alan's voice dropped to a growl. This is inappropriate. You're ambushing us. Evelyn's reply was steady. This is the reading of a will, not a debate. You're welcome to listen. He pushed his chair back an inch, then stopped. The fight in him was slipping into something else, something closer to fear. Evelyn reached for the envelope again, breaking the seal with deliberate care. The tearing sound cut through the whispers like a match striking. She drew out 3 documents, placing them side by side. This first is the will, she said. The second is a letter addressed to Ms. Cole. The third, she glanced up at Alan, is evidence Mrs. Cole wished to preserve. The air thickened. I could hear every breath in that room. Evelyn didn't look at me, but she didn't have to. Before I read this, there's one more thing you should know, she said. Your wife asked that the entire meeting be documented. Alan's chair stilled. Documented, recorded, she clarified. On video. He slammed his palm against the table. That's outrageous. It was her request, Evelyn said simply. She wanted her daughter to hear her voice again, no matter who tried to stop it. The words hit harder than any argument. My throat felt tight, but I didn't move. Alan glanced toward Kyle, but his son avoided his eyes. This isn't necessary, Alan said. She wasn't herself. Evelyn tapped the file. She was lucid. I have the date and witness signatures. She paused, then added quietly, and she was afraid she wouldn't be able to reach Hannah otherwise. The room went silent. Alan's sister, seated near the end of the table, whispered, afraid of what Evelyn didn't answer. She simply reached for a small tablet from her briefcase and placed it on the table, the screen dark for now. Kyle exhaled sharply. You're not really going to play that, he said. Evelyn raised a brow. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Alan leaned forward, his voice lowering to a hiss. Turn that off. His command landed in the same tone he'd used my entire childhood, but this time it carried no authority. You can leave if you prefer, Evelyn said evenly. But this will be heard. Ruth's hand brushed my arm under the table, a quiet gesture I didn't expect. Alan opened his mouth again, but Evelyn pressed a button and the room filled with the soft crackle of sound. My mother's voice came through, first quiet, but certain. My name is Diane Cole. Today is November 15th. The sound of her breathing filled the space, steady and deliberate. I am recording this so that my daughter Hannah will know the truth. Alan stood halfway before Walter caught his sleeve. Sit down, my uncle said. Let her speak. My mother continued. I know Alan hasn't told Hannah that I'm sick. I know he's been intercepting her emails. She paused long enough for someone to gasp. He says he's protecting me, but what he's really protecting are his lies. Alan's face turned red. She was confused. He barked. She didn't know what she was saying. Evelyn didn't stop the video. Diane's voice stayed calm. To be clear, she said, I am leaving 60% of my estate to my daughter Hannah Cole. This includes the house at 312 Cedar Avenue. The sound of a page turning followed. Alan and Kyle will receive 40% combined, which is more than fair given the circumstances. Kyle jumped up. She didn't mean that. She couldn't have Evelyn hit pause. Sit down, she said sharply. He hesitated, then sat his leg bouncing under the table. For a long moment, no one spoke. Alan stared at the dark screen, his jaw tight enough to tremble. Ruth looked like she might cry. Uncle Peter finally said what everyone was thinking. Alan, did you keep her illness from Hannah? Alan didn't look at him. I did what I thought was best, he said. She didn't need to see her mother like that. Ruth shook her head. You took that choice from her. Evelyn stacked the documents neatly. We'll resume the remainder of the video after I read the full text of the will. Her tone made it clear she was giving Alan time to compose himself, not a choice. As she began reading, I watched Alan and Kyle trade looks, panic edged with disbelief. They'd built their lives on my mother's generosity, convinced the foundation would hold forever. But every word Evelyn read shifted the ground under them. My mother's asset savings and her share of the family home were now legally mine. The pension went to Alan along with a modest bond account, but the house, the place that held every photograph and memory, belonged to me. By the time Evelyn finished, no one dared interrupt. Alan's voice came back thin and sharp. This is fraud. She manipulated her. Ms. Cole was overseas, Evelyn replied. She had no contact with your wife after you began managing her email. Ruth drew in a slow breath. Managing, she repeated. He told me Diane didn't want visitors. Evelyn turned the tablet toward Alan. Would you like to deny it on record? He didn't answer. The quiet was suffocating. When the meeting ended, the tension in that room felt like a bruise that wouldn't fade. People gathered their coats in silence, eyes fixed anywhere but mine. Alan's final words before he left were a low growl. You'll regret this. I didn't respond. Evelyn placed a hand on my arm as the door closed behind him. There's more to come, she said softly. Your mother planned carefully. I nodded, still hearing Diane's voice echo in my head, steady and unafraid. Whatever was hidden in that envelope or on that screen, it wasn't finished speaking. And somehow I knew the next time we gathered in that room, the truth would take everything Alan had left to hide. The next morning, Evelyn called and asked me to return to her office. Her voice was calm, but carried the kind of weight that said the story wasn't finished. When I arrived, the same long table was waiting, the same faces looking smaller in the daylight. Alan sat near the window, his shoulders rigid. Kyle was beside him, staring at his phone like he could text his way out of what was coming. Ruth and Walter had taken their usual seats, though this time Ruth avoided Alan's eyes. Evelyn stood at the head of the table with that same worn briefcase, a quiet authority filling the space before she even spoke. She began by setting a tablet in the center of the table. "Before we continue," she said, "your wife requested that I present additional materials, emails, documents, and testimony confirming her state of mind." She turned toward Alan. "You questioned that yesterday. Today, we'll resolve it." Alan gave a dismissive wave. "We've heard enough," he said. "You're exploiting a dying woman's confusion." Evelyn didn't look at him. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Patel both examined her in the days before this video was made. They confirmed full mental capacity. These affidavits bear their signatures. She passed the papers to the group. Alan didn't reach for them, but Ruth did, her eyes scanning the lines as her lips pressed tight. "It's her handwriting," she said quietly. Alan turned to her. "You're not a doctor." Ruth didn't answer. Evelyn took a seat, opening a slim folder. Diane also brought copies of several emails to our meeting. They were retrieved from her deleted folder. She held up a small stack. All from Hannah. The sound of my name shifted the air. Evelyn continued. Mrs. Cole discovered that Alan had been managing her email account. These messages were never seen by her until hospice staff intervened. Alan slammed his palm against the table. "I was helping her," he barked. She couldn't keep up. Evelyn's tone didn't change. She was capable of reading messages. The problem was that they'd already been deleted. She handed the top sheet to Ruth, who read silently, her throat moving. "She was writing every week," Ruth said after a moment. "Holidays, birthdays, everything." She looked up. "You told us Hannah never wrote Alan." He said nothing. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper. Evelyn pulled out another folder, this one thicker. Diane also requested I preserve records of certain financial activities that occurred during her illness. Alan's head lifted sharply. "Financial activities?" Evelyn nodded. "Specifically, a home equity loan filed 2 days after Mrs. Cole entered hospice. It required her signature. This document," she held up the copy, "shows hers and yours side by side. However, the handwriting analysis your wife requested before her death concluded the signature was forged." Alan's face turned red. "That's absurd." "It's documented," Evelyn said simply. "The forensic analyst your wife hired retained the original specimen." Kyle leaned forward. "You're accusing my father of a crime," he snapped. Evelyn didn't blink. "I'm stating the facts your mother provided." She turned back to Alan. "She believed the loan was used to pay your gambling debts and your son's car purchase. Would you like to clarify?" The silence that followed felt endless. Alan's hands tightened into fists. "I spent 2 years taking care of her," he said, his voice rising. "I paid the bills, cleaned the house, sat by her bed." "Where was she?" He pointed at me. "Off playing soldier while her mother wasted away." Ruth's voice broke through the tension. "You hid that she was dying," she said softly. "You didn't give Hannah a chance to come home." Alan turned on her. "She didn't deserve one." The words hit harder than shouting. Evelyn reached for the tablet and turned it on. "Let's continue," she said. The screen flickered, and my mother's face appeared again, tired, thinner than before, but steady. "If Alan is in the room," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "I want him to listen carefully. You told everyone Hannah abandoned me. That's a lie. You deleted her messages, intercepted her calls, and spent my money pretending it was for my care." Alan pushed back his chair. "Turn that off," he shouted. Evelyn didn't move. The video continued. "Alan, my mother said you forged my signature on a loan and emptied my savings account. You think no one would find out, but I did, and I made sure others would too." The camera trembled slightly as she drew a breath. "To my daughter, if you're hearing this, it means they tried to keep you away. You didn't fail me. You were serving your country. You honored me every day you put on that uniform." Ruth wiped at her eyes, a quiet sob catching in her throat. Alan's voice came out low and shaking. "She's manipulating you," he said to Evelyn. "You're in on this." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "Your wife hired me 6 months before she died. She wanted everything verified." Alan looked at the family, his words turning frantic. She wasn't herself. She didn't know what she was doing. Uncle Peter spoke for the first time that morning. "You told us she didn't want to see visitors," he said slowly. "You said she was resting." Alan didn't answer. The video played on. "To my family, my mother said you may have believed his stories. I don't blame you. But truth has a way of surfacing." Her eyes shifted almost as if she could see me. "Hannah, this house is yours now. Make it a place of warmth again. Let it heal what he broke." The screen went dark. For a moment no one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to fill the quiet. Then Evelyn said softly, "Mrs. Cole requested that this recording remain in the file until her estate is settled." She gathered the papers and slid them into an envelope. Alan stood abruptly, his voice breaking through the hush. "This is all staged. You people are vultures. I'm calling my lawyer." "You're free to do that," Evelyn replied. "But any attempt to contest the will activates a forfeiture clause." She opened another file. Everything would then transfer to the Veterans Foundation in Hannah's name. Alan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Kyle muttered something under his breath and stared down at the table. Ruth looked at me, her expression torn between shame and relief. "We should have known," she whispered. Evelyn closed the briefcase with a soft click. "Your mother planned every detail," she said quietly. She wanted the truth recorded no matter who tried to bury it. When the meeting ended, the air outside felt sharper than before, colder in a way that had nothing to do with weather. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the sound of my mother's voice still echoing in my head. Inside through the glass doors I could see Alan arguing with Ruth, his hands slicing through the air, his face pale. Evelyn stepped up beside me. "This isn't over," she said. "He'll push back, but everything's documented." I nodded, the weight of her words settling deep in my chest. By the time I reached my car, the first call from an unknown number was already flashing across my phone. Then another, and another. I didn't answer. The message had been clear: some battles aren't fought with noise. As I drove away, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, I didn't look like the child he'd sent away. I looked like the daughter my mother raised. The next notice would arrive sooner than anyone expected, and the line between inheritance and justice would finally start to blur. 3 days passed before I heard from Evelyn again. Her message was short. "You'll want to be here tomorrow morning." I drove back to her office, the sky still gray with early fog, the kind that muffles sound and makes the world feel smaller. When I walked in, the chairs were already full. Alan sat stiff-backed, his tie too tight, his eyes shadowed. Kyle scrolled through his phone, pretending not to notice me. Ruth and Walter were quiet beside him, and Uncle Peter leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, waiting. Evelyn stood near the window, a thin stack of documents in her hands. She nodded at me as I took my seat. "Thank you for coming," she said. "This meeting concerns the implementation of your mother's will." Alan let out a bitter laugh. "Implementation," he said, repeating the word like it tasted bad. "You mean the theft of what's mine." Evelyn met his stare. "What's yours is clearly outlined in the document we read last week. This meeting isn't for debate, it's for transfer." She placed the papers on the table, sliding one toward me. "This is the deed to the Cole house on Cedar Avenue. It was your mother's wish that you take ownership immediately." The sound that came from Alan was half laugh, half growl. "You can't do that," he said. "That's my home." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. "As of today, it's not." She turned to me. "You'll need to sign in 2 places, here and here." My hand was steady as I wrote my name. Each stroke of the pen felt final, the kind of motion that leaves no room for reversal. Alan's face turned a shade darker. "You can't just waltz in here after 12 years and take everything," he hissed. "That house is mine by marriage." Evelyn didn't blink. Not anymore. The property was in Diane's name alone, and per her last directive, ownership transfers to her daughter. Alan pushed back his chair so hard it scraped against the tile. "I'll contest this," he said. "You'll regret it." Evelyn opened a folder and handed him another paper. "You can try," she said evenly, "but if you do, your share is forfeited and will be donated to the Veterans Foundation in Hannah's name." The silence that followed was long and deep. Alan glanced at Kyle, who looked suddenly smaller, as if the air had left him. "This isn't fair," Kyle said quietly. "Mom would have wanted balance." Evelyn looked at him with something like pity. "Your mother wanted truth," she said, and she documented it carefully. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind as the others filed out. Through the glass door, I saw Alan arguing with Ruth in the hallway. She turned away from him, shaking her head, and walked out without another word. Evelyn came to stand beside me. "Your mother thought of everything," she said softly. She even anticipated what he'd try next. She handed me an envelope with my name written across it. "This is for the property transfer. The taxes are overdue by 3 months. She wanted you to handle them yourself, said it would make it real." I nodded and slipped it into my bag. That afternoon, I drove to the county office downtown. The building smelled faintly of paper and old coffee, the air humming with printers and quiet voices. Behind the counter, a woman with short blonde hair looked up. "Morning, how can I help?" Her nameplate read Marcia Lee. I handed her the deed and identification. "I'm here to record a property transfer," I said. She scanned the document, then smiled faintly. "You're Diane Cole's daughter," she said. "Your mother used to come in here every year to check her records herself. Said she didn't trust those men to keep them straight." Her voice softened. She was a smart woman. I felt something shift in my chest, at that something that was both grief and pride. As Marcia stamped the papers, she frowned slightly. "It looks like a lien was placed on the property," she said. $200,000 issued last year. But wait. She clicked through a few screens. "It was marked for investigation last month. Someone flagged it as potential fraud. I didn't need to ask who." Marcia looked up. "The report came from an attorney, Evelyn Hart. You're clear now. The lien's frozen pending review." I thanked her, the relief sinking in slowly, almost too heavy to feel. She slid the newly stamped document back across the counter. "Congratulations, Ms. Cole," she said. "It's officially yours." Outside, the winter air cut clean and sharp. The house waited a few miles away, the same one I'd left behind more than a decade ago. When I pulled into the driveway, the front porch looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was faded, the flower boxes empty, but the outline of what once was still there. I stood on the porch a long time before unlocking the door. The air inside was stale, a mix of dust and old carpet cleaner. Light filtered through thin curtains touching the edge of the photo frames, still hanging on the wall. Weddings, birthdays, family vacations that looked complete without me. Alan appeared at the top of the stairs, his voice echoing down. "You shouldn't be here yet," he said. "You've got no right to walk in until I'm ready to leave." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "You've got 29 days, I said quietly. He came down a few steps, eyes dark. "You think you've won something I didn't win," I said. "Mom made a decision." He laughed once, dry and bitter. "You were always her charity case. She pitied you." His words landed like old blows, familiar enough to dull on contact. "Then pity built a better life than lies ever could," I said, meeting his eyes. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy against the stairs. I spent that night cleaning what had once been my room. The wallpaper was peeling, and the dresser drawers still smelled faintly of lemon polish. Under the window, I found a small metal box, one of my mother's. Inside were old photographs, a hospital wristband, and a note folded neatly in her handwriting. "Check the attic before you paint." I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Dust hung in the air, catching the light from the single small window. Boxes were stacked against the wall, labeled in my mother's tidy script. One was marked private. Inside, I found a smaller envelope sealed with tape. The handwriting on the front said, "Only for Hannah." I opened it carefully. Inside were printouts of emails, copies of the messages Evelyn had mentioned, the ones Alan deleted, and a list of account numbers tied to his name. At the bottom was a note in my mother's handwriting. "You can't undo what they did, but you can make sure they never do it again." By the time I climbed back down, the house felt different. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore, it was waiting. I placed the envelope in my bag and looked around at the walls, the photos, the furniture that didn't belong to him anymore. The sun was setting through the front windows, casting long streaks of light across the floorboards. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Alan was still there, pacing, maybe thinking about what he could salvage. I knew there would be more to face, lawyers' papers, the inevitable fallout, but for the first time I didn't feel like I was walking back into a past that controlled me. I was standing in a home my mother had fought to protect, one built on proof instead of promises. Outside, the last light of day touched the front steps, and I locked the door behind me. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear church bells marking the hour. The moment stretched quiet and certain. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this much truth had a way of staying put, no matter who tried to bury it. And before the month was over, everyone still clinging to my mother's lies would have to face exactly what she left behind. 2 weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet tension. Alan still lived in the house, though the boxes in the hallway showed he'd started packing. Kyle came and went with the same restless energy, avoiding eye contact whenever our paths crossed. I spent the days restoring what I could, washing curtains, opening windows, letting sunlight touch rooms that hadn't felt fresh air in years. At night, I reread my mother's letters, each one unfolding another piece of what she'd hidden to protect me. Evelyn called one afternoon. "The bank investigator will reach out soon," she said. "He's been reviewing the forged loan your mother mentioned." Her voice carried that steady calm that always made things sound manageable. "When he contacts you, just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." The call came the next morning. "Ms. Cole," a man's voice asked, "this is Dan Mitchell from National Bank Fraud Services. I'm handling the case concerning the home equity loan on Cedar Avenue." He sounded professional, but not cold, like someone used to seeing both sides of every story. We arranged to meet at Evelyn's office that afternoon. When I arrived, Dan was already there, a tall man in a navy suit, the kind that looked worn from long hours, not vanity. He opened a folder filled with copies of forms and signatures. "This is the loan in question," he said, pointing to the pages. "It was filed with your mother's name, but the handwriting analysis doesn't match. We also have verification that her medical condition made signing impossible at the time." He flipped to another page showing Alan's signature beside hers. "It seems Mr. Mercer applied for this alone using power of attorney he didn't have." Evelyn leaned forward. "Diane revoked all power of attorney 2 months before hospice. It's in her file." Dan nodded. "That aligns with our findings." The money was transferred to a joint account between Alan Mercer and his son Kyle. Large withdrawals followed payments to a dealership casino transactions and credit transfers to multiple cards. He closed the folder. "The bank will be filing a formal complaint with law enforcement. We'll also place a lien freeze on his accounts until the investigation concludes." Alan burst into the office mid-meeting, his voice loud before the door even shut. "You think you can drag my name through the mud?" he barked. "That house, that money, it was mine to manage." Dan didn't stand. "Mr. Mercer, this meeting is about documentation, not opinion." Alan's face turned red. "You people don't understand. She was dying. I was keeping the lights on." Evelyn's tone stayed calm. "With casino transactions?" she asked. Alan looked from her to me, his expression flickering between anger and desperation. "She wanted you to have everything," he said bitterly. "I just took what I was owed." Dan closed his briefcase. "Mr. Mercer, you'll receive a notice within 48 hours. I suggest you retain counsel." He stood, offered his card to me, and left. The door clicked softly behind him. Alan slumped into the nearest chair. "You think this makes you better than me?" he said. "You and that lawyer woman pretending to be heroes." Evelyn gathered her papers. "It's not about being better, Alan. It's about being honest." He stared at me for a long time before standing. "You're going to regret crossing me," he said quietly. "You have no idea what this will cost you." Then he left his footsteps fading down the hallway. Evelyn looked at me, her expression unreadable. "He's cornered," she said. "People make noise when they're cornered." That evening I drove back to Cedar Avenue. The house glowed softly under the porch light. Through the window I could see boxes stacked near the stairs, and Alan pacing by the living room window phone pressed to his ear. I didn't go inside. Instead, I sat in the car and watched the outline of what used to be home. My mother's rose bushes lined the walkway, brittle but still standing like they'd been waiting out a long winter. The next morning, Ruth stopped by with a casserole dish and a stack of mail the post office had misdirected. She looked tired but kind. "It's a mess, isn't it?" she said as I opened the door. "Alan's been calling everyone saying you're ruining him." She sighed. "He's the one who did this to himself." She set the dish on the counter and pulled out an envelope from the stack. "This one's from the Veterans Association," she said. "Looks important." I opened it and found a letter confirming the transfer of my mother's final donation, a $20,000 bequest she'd arranged in her will. At the bottom, a handwritten note from her attorney read, "She wanted this to carry your name, the Diane and Hannah Cole Service Fund." I felt the air leave the room for a moment. Ruth placed a hand on my shoulder. "She was proud of you," she said softly, "no matter what he told you." By late afternoon, Alan's car was gone from the driveway. Kyle's truck was still there, parked crooked near the curb. Inside, the sound of boxes shifting echoed through the hallway. I found Kyle in the den, sorting papers into uneven piles. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking up. "Your father's gone," I said. "You should start packing." He stopped, his shoulders stiff. "Where's he gone?" Evelyn didn't say. "Probably to a lawyer." He turned, then eyes red. "You think you fixed everything? You've just made it worse." "He doesn't quit." I met his gaze. "Then he'll have to learn how." He shook his head. "You don't understand him. He doesn't lose." "He already has," I said. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he gathered a handful of papers and shoved them into a box. "You're not the only one she hurt. You know," he said quietly. "Mom always made him feel like second best. You were the favorite even when you weren't around." His words landed somewhere I didn't expect. She gave him everything I said. He just wanted more. Kyle didn't answer. He taped the box shut and walked past me without another word. That night the house was silent again. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same one where my mother used to balance her checkbook. Her handwriting still covered the margin of an old notepad beside the phone lists of grocery items, reminders to call Ruth, and a small note at the bottom. "Keep your head up, sweetheart." The words caught me off guard. I traced the letters with my finger, imagining her voice saying them the way she used to. When morning came, the sound of a car engine pulled me to the window. Alan's car was back, but this time a police cruiser followed behind. 2 officers stepped out, one carrying a folder. I opened the front door as they approached. "Ms. Cole," the taller officer asked, "we have a warrant to serve Mr. Mercer." Alan stood at the edge of the driveway, pale and shaking. He looked at me once before the officers led him toward the car. "You did this," he said quietly. "You destroyed this family." I didn't answer. Evelyn arrived later that day, her briefcase tucked under one arm. "The bank filed charges," she said. "Forgery, fraud, and misappropriation of estate assets. They'll process him today." She looked around the house, the freshly cleared hallway, the light falling across the floor. "Your mother would have liked seeing it this way," she said. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, except for the soft rustle of leaves along the sidewalk. I stood on the porch as the sun dipped low, the same spot where my mother used to wait when I came home from school. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt honest, even in its emptiness. Alan's voice still lingered in memory, sharp and certain, but it no longer carried weight. That evening, I found the key Evelyn had given me for my mother's safety deposit box. The small brass tag read, Vault 237. I turned it in my hand, wondering what was still waiting to be uncovered. Tomorrow, I would drive downtown and open it. Whatever my mother left inside it was meant for this moment, the final piece of truth she wanted me to find, before I decided what to do next. The morning I went to open my mother's safety deposit box, the air carried that soft chill of early spring, bright enough to promise warmth, but still sharp around the edges. I parked outside Westfield Savings Bank, just as the first customers were trickling in the glass doors, reflecting streaks of pale sunlight. Inside the building was quiet, the hum of printers and low voices blending into the faint smell of polished wood and paper. I told the clerk my name and handed her the brass key. She nodded and motioned for me to wait. A few minutes later, a woman in a gray suit appeared, her hair pulled into a neat bun streaked with silver. "Ms. Cole," she asked, "I'm a Lane Foster vault officer. If you'll come with me, I'll take you to the box." Her tone was gentle, almost maternal, and I followed her down a narrow hallway lined with small metal doors. She stopped halfway, inserted a master key beside mine, and turned both locks. The door opened with a soft click. Inside was a long metal drawer, surprisingly light as she set it on the table. "Take all the time you need," she said, before leaving me alone. For a moment I just stared at it. Then I lifted the lid. Inside were 3 neatly stacked envelopes and a small velvet pouch tied with ribbon. On top, in my mother's handwriting, was a note. "For Hannah, when it's time to stop surviving and start living again." The first envelope contained photo snapshots I'd never seen. There was one of my mother at a 4th of July picnic laughing her arm around a woman I didn't recognize. Another showed her at my basic training graduation standing beside a flagpole I remembered, though I hadn't realized anyone had taken a picture that day. She must have been watching from the crowd, unseen but present. I set the photos aside and opened the second envelope. It was full of legal documents, copies of investment accounts, and property titles I didn't know existed. A letter on top explained that she had quietly built savings separate from Allen investments she'd hidden once she realized he was siphoning money. She had listed me as the sole beneficiary, along with contact information for Evelyn. I'd thought everything had been uncovered already, but this was something more proof that she had stayed one step ahead even while dying. The last envelope held a single-page letter folded in thirds. Her handwriting was still graceful, though the ink wavered slightly near the bottom. "My sweet girl," it began. "If you're reading this, it means you've faced the truth I couldn't speak aloud. I'm proud of you for standing firm. The accounts in your name are enough to give you a foundation, something no one can touch or take away. But use them wisely. Not for revenge, not for what's past, but for what's next. You always had a gift for helping others find their footing. Maybe one day you'll use this to build something lasting." When I reached the end, my hands were trembling. I sat there for a long time before opening the velvet pouch. Inside was her wedding ring, the one that had belonged to my grandmother before her. It was heavier than I remembered, warm from being held the metal catching light in quiet flashes. I slipped it onto my finger. It fit perfectly. Elaine returned after a while, giving me a soft smile when she saw the ring. "She came here 3 days before she passed," she said. "Told me she needed to make sure her daughter would be taken care of. I remember her saying, 'She's stronger than she knows.'" Her voice was steady but kind. "You remind me of her." I thanked her and left the box contents tucked safely in my bag. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain on the way. On the drive home, I kept the ring turned toward the sunlight on the steering wheel. For the first time, the weight of everything didn't feel like burden. It felt like anchor. When I got back to Cedar Avenue, Kyle's truck was gone. The front door stood open, the sound of drawers and boxes echoing faintly inside. I found him in the living room, sealing the last of his things into a cardboard box. He looked up when he heard me. "I'm out of your way," he said. His voice was flat, tired. "Dad's staying at a motel near the courthouse. He says he's going to fight the charges." I nodded, leaning against the doorway. "He can fight them," I said quietly, "but the evidence won't change." Kyle sighed. "He keeps saying you turned her against him." I didn't answer. After a moment he added, "He's wrong. She saw through him long before you did." He picked up the box and paused. "You know, he said I used to think he was right about you, that you were just lucky. But maybe luck looks different when someone actually earns it." He didn't wait for a reply. He carried the box outside and loaded it into the truck. When the engine faded down the street, the house felt still again, but not empty, more like cleared space waiting for what came next. That evening, Evelyn stopped by with a folder under her arm. "The bank case is moving forward," she said. "Alan's attorney reached out for a settlement meeting, but the bank refused. They're proceeding with criminal charges." She set the folder on the kitchen table and looked around the room. "You've done well, Hannah. Your mother would be proud." We went over the next steps: court dates, estate paperwork, how to transfer the investment accounts. When we finished, she closed her briefcase and hesitated before speaking again. "There's one more thing," she said. "Your mother mentioned something about a foundation. She asked me to help if you ever decided to create one." She slid a single page across the table. It was a blank form for establishing a charitable trust. "You don't have to decide now," she said, "but it's here when you're ready." After she left, I sat at the kitchen table long after the sun went down. The ring caught the light from the small lamp beside me. I thought about the soldiers I'd served with, the friends who'd struggled after coming home, the stories I'd heard that never made it past the barracks walls. My mother's letter came back to me. Use it for what's next. Maybe she had seen something I hadn't yet. The next morning, I drove to the Veterans Outreach Center downtown. The small brick building stood between a coffee shop and a library, its windows lined with faded flyers. Inside, a few volunteers were sorting donations. A woman at the front desk looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I think so," I said. "I'm looking to set up a meeting about funding assistance programs for female veterans specifically." She introduced herself as Carmen Rivera, Program Director, and led me to her office. The walls were lined with photos of servicewomen shaking hands with graduates, nurses, engineers. "We've been trying to expand our housing support program," she explained, "but grants are hard to come by." I handed her one of Evelyn's business cards and said, "Maybe we can change that." We talked for nearly an hour, sketching out what would become the first draft of the Diane Cole Foundation for Women in Service. By the time I left, the rain had started in earnest, steady and clean, washing the dust off the sidewalks. Back home, I hung my uniform jacket by the door and stood in the quiet kitchen. The letter from the vault lay open on the counter, the words I'd read a dozen times, now beginning to feel like direction rather than memory. My mother had planned for this long before either of us knew it would come to this. Every document, every account, every truth folded carefully into place until I was ready to see it. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, soft but certain, the kind that signals the start of a new season. The house felt alive again, no longer a monument to what had been taken, but to what could finally begin. Tomorrow I'd call Evelyn and Carmen to finalize the paperwork. The foundation would carry my mother's name, but the work would belong to every woman who had fought her way back home. And somewhere between the storm and the morning, I realized that this was what she'd meant by living again. The weeks that followed moved with the strange rhythm that comes after a storm quiet, but charged like the air hadn't quite settled yet. Alan's arrest made the local paper within days. The headline read, "Community figure indicted for forgery and misuse of estate funds." I didn't expect to see my name printed beneath his, but there it was linked to every detail he'd tried to hide. I sat at the kitchen table with the paper folded open, the coffee growing cold beside me. Outside Cedar Avenue was calm, neighbors walking dogs, mailboxes clattering shut, life going on as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Evelyn called that afternoon. "It's official," she said. "The court has frozen his remaining accounts and scheduled a preliminary hearing." Her tone was practical, but I could tell she was relieved. "The DA's office will contact you about testifying if it goes to trial." I thanked her, and after we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet of that house that no longer belonged to him. 2 days later, a knock came at the door. It was Ruth holding a grocery bag and a hesitant smile. "I thought you could use some company," she said. I invited her in, and she looked around the living room like she was seeing it for the first time. The furniture was different now, lighter, the curtains open. "Your mother loved this room," she said softly. "It feels like her again." We ate sandwiches at the kitchen table. Ruth told me the town had turned against Alan overnight. Once the story broke, people started remembering things, misplaced donations. Old debts, favors never returned. She shook her head. He had everyone fooled, even me. When she left, she pressed an envelope into my hand. "From the church committee," she said. "They wanted you to have this." Inside was a handwritten card signed by half the congregation, notes of apology lines about respect and forgiveness. I didn't know what to say. For years, those same people had whispered about me. Now their words felt like something new, acknowledgement, maybe even understanding. By the end of the month, the house was fully mine. The paperwork cleared, the deed transferred, and the keys changed. I started renovating in small ways, fresh paint in the hallways, new shelves in the kitchen, the kind of work that gave my hands something to do while my mind caught up. Every room felt like it was exhaling, releasing the years it had been forced to hold its breath. Carmen called from the Veterans Center one evening. "We're ready to move forward," she said. "The paperwork for the foundation came through." Her voice carried a warmth that reached through the phone. "We can start the first housing project next month if you're still on board." I didn't hesitate. I'm on board. We met the next day at the old community hall downtown. The tables were covered in blueprints and formed stacks of grant applications and mugs of lukewarm coffee. Carmen introduced me to the volunteers, a mix of local veterans, social workers, and 2 women who'd recently finished transitional housing programs. They're the ones who'll tell us what really works, Carmen said. We worked late into the evening drafting a proposal. By the time we left the hallway, lights had switched to their night cycle, glowing soft and gold. Standing in the parking lot, Carmen looked at me with a tired smile. You know, she said your mother's name will help open doors for this program, but your story, that's what people will listen to. I nodded, though the weight of that truth sat heavy on my chest. A week later, Evelyn joined me at the courthouse for Alan's hearing. The corridor smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. Reporters waited near the entrance cameras, flashing as he was escorted in, wearing a gray suit that suddenly looked too large. He didn't meet my eyes, but when the judge read the charges, 3 counts of fraud, 1 of forgery, his jaw tightened. The bank's evidence was clear, the signatures irrefutable. His attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, but the prosecutor countered with dates and records that left no room for doubt. When it ended, the bailiff called a recess. Alan turned then, his eyes finding mine for the first time since that day on the porch. For a moment, he looked like the man I'd once tried to call family proud, certain unyielding, but that pride had cracked. "You think this makes you better than me?" he said under his breath as the guards moved him toward the side exit. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Outside, reporters swarmed Evelyn asking for statements. She kept it brief. "This case was never about revenge," she said calmly. "It's about truth and accountability." The next morning, her quote was printed beside a photo of the courthouse steps. It was the first time my mother's name appeared in the paper without being shadowed by his. In early summer, the Diane Cole Foundation for Women in Service officially launched. The ceremony was small, but meaningful. Veterans, volunteers, and community leaders gathered in the restored town hall. Carmen gave the opening remarks, her voice steady but emotional. "This program began with one woman's story," she said. "A daughter who refused to let silence have the final word." When she motioned for me to step forward, the room rose to its feet. I spoke simply, the way my mother would have liked. I thanked the people who made it possible, then read a line from her last letter. "When the world forgets your worth, remember it's your job to remind them." The applause that followed felt like more than approval. It felt like release. That night, after everyone left, I walked through the quiet hall alone. The lights glowed low, reflecting off the new plaque mounted near the entrance. It read, "Dedicated to Diane Cole, who taught her daughter to lead with truth." I touched the edge of the metal and thought about all the years she spent fighting quietly from behind closed doors and how her strength had found its way here. A few days later, a certified letter arrived from the prosecutor's office. Alan had accepted a plea deal, 10 years in state prison, full restitution of the fraudulent funds and forfeiture of his inheritance. His accounts would be liquidated to cover damages, with the remainder directed to the foundation in my mother's name. Evelyn called to confirm the details. "He didn't fight it," she said. "Not this time." That evening, as the sun slipped low across the porch, I found myself watching the light stretch over the old fence line. The same view my mother must have seen countless times. For once, it didn't feel haunted by what we'd lost. It felt steady, like something had finally come full circle. Later that night, a message came through my phone from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy now." No name, but I didn't need one. I read it twice, then deleted it. Some things didn't deserve to stay. In the morning, I'd drive back to the center for another meeting with Carmen and the new volunteers. We were preparing for the first group of women to move into the transitional housing program, 12 veterans all starting over in their own way. It felt right that this home, rebuilt from so much loss, would open its doors to others finding their way back too. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, the house felt peaceful. The creaks in the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of a place finally at rest. I stopped at my mother's framed photo on the hallway wall. The smile in that picture was soft, but knowing. "We did it, Mom," I said quietly. "It's finally over." But as I reached for the light switch, I realized it wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The fight had ended, yes, but what came next was its own kind of work, rebuilding, giving, and remembering how to live in peace again. And that was the kind of victory my mother would have understood best. The first summer of the Diane Cole Foundation moved faster than I expected. What started as an idea written on a coffee-stained napkin became a real building filled with laughter, clattering dishes, and the sound of women finding their footing again. Every week brought someone new through the door, veterans unpacking boxes, learning routines, or simply rediscovering what it meant to feel safe. Sometimes I'd stay late in the common room helping them fill out job applications or talking about things that didn't need fixing, only understanding. Carmen oversaw the programs with her usual calm focus, and together we watched the place grow. Evelyn came by one morning with a folder of final estate documents. "It's all settled," she said, smiling faintly. "Your mother's name is clean, her wishes fulfilled, and her legacy protected." She hesitated before adding, "Alan's appeal was denied last week." I nodded. There was no triumph in the news, only finality. "He'll serve his full term," she continued. "The restitution payments have already begun. Most of it will go directly to the foundation." She closed her briefcase and looked around the bright room. "Your mother would be proud." That night, after everyone had left, I walked the quiet hallway lined with framed photos of the first residents, smiling faces, certificates in hand, a collage of new beginnings. Near the end of the corridor hung my mother's picture, the same one from our old mantel. The gold frame caught the soft light as if she were standing there watching it all unfold. I stopped in front of it, my reflection blending faintly with hers in the glass. "We did it, Mom," I whispered, "and we're still going." The next morning I visited the cemetery for the first time in months. The sky was clear, the air still. I brought fresh lilies, the kind she used to grow behind the kitchen window. Her headstone was simple, Diane Cole, beloved mother and friend. I traced the carved letters with my fingers, feeling the cool stone under my hand. "It's strange," I said quietly, "how peace doesn't come all at once. It comes in pieces like sunlight through the trees." I told her about the foundation, about Carmen, and the women who'd moved in, about Ruth visiting every Sunday with fresh bread. I even mentioned Kyle, who'd sent a brief note last week from out of state. No excuses, just gratitude for the second chance his job at a construction firm had given him. Maybe that was enough. As I stood to leave, a small wind moved through the trees, scattering the petals across the grass. For a moment, the world felt wide open again, like something inside me had loosened its grip. I didn't need forgiveness or applause. What I needed was already here, the quiet certainty that truth had done what it was meant to do. Later that afternoon, the house on Cedar Avenue felt warm in a way it hadn't in years. The walls no longer echoed with arguments or silence. They carried music, the hum of conversation, the easy rhythm of an ordinary life. Ruth stopped by with a basket of vegetables from her garden, and we cooked dinner together the way my mother once did, with laughter and too much butter. When she left, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the lights from the neighborhood flicker on one by one. It struck me then how endings are never clean breaks. They fade like twilight, leaving behind enough light to find your way forward. My mother had spent her final months building a path I didn't even know I'd need. Evelyn's steady guidance, Carmen's dedication, Ruth's quiet loyalty, they'd all been part of that foundation too. Every act of truth, every document, every conversation had led here. The stars came out one by one, soft and patient. I thought about the women who would walk through the foundation's doors tomorrow, carrying their own stories of loss and rebuilding. Some would stay for weeks, others for months. All of them would leave changed, not because of what we gave them, but because of what they found in themselves. That was my mother's real gift, the reminder that strength doesn't have to shout to be heard. Before going inside, I looked once more toward the darkened street, the quiet hum of summer in the air. I felt the weight of everything behind me and the promise of what was still ahead. Justice had brought clarity, but compassion had brought peace. And somewhere between those two things, I'd found myself again. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that closure isn't about winning. It's about releasing the need to prove you were right. Sometimes justice looks like a courtroom, and sometimes it looks like a light left on for someone who's finally coming home. So if you've been carrying something heavy, hurt anger, or the memory of a door slammed too soon, set it down for a moment. Let the truth breathe. Let peace find its way in. And when it does, share it. Tell your story. You never know who might need to hear that healing is still possible. Thank you for listening, for walking through this story with me. If it spoke to something in your heart, take a moment to reflect, to share, or to subscribe, so these stories can keep finding the people who need them most.